All right, good morning, everyone. Again, this is Margaret Wise with ARC, and welcome to our webinar today that we're featuring Craig Lemasters on the topic of grit. This was, we were originally having CX Summit scheduled for a little bit earlier this month as an in-person event, and we have moved almost all of our presentations to virtual formats and webinars and virtual workshops, and we're so glad that you were able to join us online today. And I'd like to give a thank you to our sponsors of CX Summit who have continued to support us even as we've moved our sessions to virtual content. AB Tasty, which is optimization software, Full Story, which allows you to do website analytics and playback and understand your user behavior on your site, Crown Peak, which is a CMS solution, and FRM, which powers franchises. So thank you again to all of our sponsors. Today we are welcoming Craig Lemasters, and I first heard Craig speak, and he was speaking on the topic of getting unstuck as a leader. And this is what, when we reschedule our CX Summit for a live event, he's going to join us in person and speak about that. But today we decided to switch topics just a little bit and have him feature on grit. Craig is president of GXG Consulting as an author and a speaker and advisor, and his name might be familiar to you as having led Assurance Solutions for 11 years. And through that, he experienced a lot of growth and disruption and changing business models. And two of his major initiatives that he was responsible for, particularly driving around international and digital, were the fastest growing business segments for him. And so he got a lot of experience around both the ideas of getting unstuck and around grit. And so, Craig, I'd like to thank you for joining us today online, and very much look forward to hearing you speak.
Well, terrific. Thank you, Margaret. First of all, thanks for including me, and hello, everyone. Looking forward to being with you in person when we get back to things in a more normal mode. But I have three quick things I want to mention as we get started. First, again, thanks, Margaret, and to your company as well. I think it's really cool that ARC is doing this in these times of uncertainty that we're going through now. It's kind of easy just to hit the pause button and not push on. And I was thrilled when Margaret reached out and said that you want to do these things online and just keep content going. I really appreciate the commitment you guys have to do this. And again, it's a real privilege to share a few thoughts with you today. The second thing I want to do is to thank all of you guys for listening in today and joining us. Again, in these uncertain times, one of the things that I see that we all struggle with, and just because it's very different what we're doing, is what to do with our time. And we're learning really a new way to work and operate for most of us, doing a lot of online and virtual stuff. And so you could choose to use this time anyway right now. And it means a lot to me that you would join us for a few minutes. And I take that very seriously, and I'll do my best over the next 30 or 40 minutes to share with you some thoughts that I hope are useful. And that really leads me to my third topic. And that is our topic today, grit. And it's something that I will, in the spirit of full disclosure, tell you that I'm incredibly passionate about and have been for a long time, since I started both studying the topic and then ultimately using it in my own work life and personal life. So it's something that I'm just on a normal day passionate about. But I think, again, in the times that we're in now, I can't think of many more relevant topics than this. So I'm thrilled to get a chance to share it with you. And that's really my goal today, is just simply to share the topic with you. Whether you buy into it and the importance of it, obviously entirely up to you. But I love just telling a little bit about my story and how this has helped me over many years. So let's dive in and get started. Let me start with the perspective that I'm coming from. And I think this is important as we share ideas. And I sat through, like you all are doing, many talks and presentations over the years, and running a large company. And I was always curious of where people were coming from and what was the perspective of folks that were sharing ideas with me. And I'd like to do that now and just give you a little bit of where I'm coming from. And my perspective, I think, might be a little bit of a unique mix in that I am an operator. As Margaret said, I ran a large company for a long time. I worked for the same company, Assurant, and its successor companies for 27 years, and then had the really good fortune to be CEO for 11 years. I did a bit of an odd thing a few years ago, decided to leave that role and become more of an advisor. And the reason I did that was largely some of the things we'll talk about today. And that is, I stumbled on and met some people that really changed the trajectory of how I thought about leadership and how I thought, you heard me talk a lot about being stuck and unstuck, and how do we as leaders get unstuck when we're faced with really challenging things. And so my perspective, and the reason I hope this is important, is that I'm one of you, and I come at these topics really as an operator and somebody that's sat in the chair that you all are sitting in today. And I say that in the context that I think these jobs are really hard. I think what you're doing on a good day is really hard. There's lots of challenges in leadership. We have to make choices, which I think is the right definition of leadership, is we have to make choices. And it's often very hard. And first of all, I don't think leaders hear that enough. I don't know, I can't see any of you obviously, but I'm guessing I'd get some nod heads right now if I said, when you come into work every day, how many people walk over to you and say, you know, what you're doing is super hard, and I really appreciate that. Let me help you. So that's the perspective I come at. I sat in the chair. I think it's really hard. Found some things that I think are really helpful, and that's really my passion in life's work now, is to share these things. The other perspective I come at is a simple formula that we use in my work now, and it's I call this the wisdom formula. And again, this is just the headset of how I will share ideas with you today, but I call this the wisdom formula because W equals is wisdom. And my definition of wisdom is pretty straightforward. It's this unique intersection of knowledge and experience, but it has to be both. And my perspective on most of the things that I've learned and that we use now in the practice that I'm in and that I used as a CEO were really based on this formula, that if I could surround myself and find these nuggets of wisdom and these wise people that have this unique intersection of knowledge and experience, this could be a game changer in how I get unstuck, no matter what that challenge might be. So that's how I come to you today in terms of again, my perspective. And I think these are hard jobs. So my goal today is to help you with a couple of ideas around grit that might make it a little bit easier. And I want to start with this quiz. So if you take out your phone, this will be one of the rare occasions in a talk you're going to be asked to bring your phone out probably. And if you would just take a picture, if you put your camera on the QR code, you should get a pop-up for a website, and just click on that. And this is a quick quiz. We usually have a timer on here, but I'll let you do it at your leisure if you would start. But I'll give you about a minute or so of just quiet, I promise. But if you go to that website, it's a very quick 10-question quiz produced by Angela Duckworth, who I'll talk about later, but Angela's done a lot of work on this topic around grit and really was the person who did the original research. But if you would just pop up the quiz and just start going through the questions. It's 10 quick questions. Like most of these type of quizzes or research, it's better if you do it quickly, and then you'll see at the bottom, if you click on it, you can score it. So let me be quiet for about a minute, let you do that. This will be really important as we close up in about 25 minutes. We're going to want to go back to this score. So let me give you just a minute to work on this. And again, if you would just keep your score up or take a note of it, and we'll circle back to that score in a few minutes. So let's press on. And what I want to do in terms of context as we get to the grit topic is talk about what I call just briefly needle movers. And again, as a leader of a large company, I tried to simplify the 2 or 3 things that I believed really moved the needle on leadership and ultimately my organization. So by definition, these were the things that I believed if we really focused on could move the organization in whatever direction we were going, or even more importantly, help me when I personally got stuck as a leader, which was a lot. And I think we all are faced with that. So to get to grit, let me just give you the context. The first needle mover that became very important to me over time was what I would call thoroughbreds and thoroughbreds only. This was my people strategy. And it's how I thought about the talent in an organization. And if you're a horse person, and normally when we're live, I get some interesting feedback on this, and in the audience, we typically have a few horse people. But if you just think about the thoroughbred for a second and some of the basic qualities of a thoroughbred, this was the picture that I sort of had in terms of building teams. And we wanted to go find, and I wanted to find the best of the best, which is what the thoroughbred is. It is the best racehorse. It's the one with the most agility, the most spirited, the most speed, but they tend to be the hardest to sort of control. And what I found over time, if we kept this visual and true to it, that we really did go look for and find the best talent. We helped them learn in the best and most efficient way, and then we put the best tools in place to retain it. Thoroughbreds can be a little hard to manage sometimes, but what we found was you keep them in the guardrails, and then you can really unleash the potential of people. So that's how I thought about my first needle mover. The second one is this thing called the strategy trap. And again, let me have a disclaimer here for my consulting friends, and use lots of wonderful consultants in my years running a public company. This is not an anti-consulting comment. It's just to say there are lots of great strategies out there. And the trap part is we tend to go in this vicious cycle of looking at and analyzing and debating strategies and not just pick one or maybe two. And what I found over the years in my own organization and now in our practice working with many companies all over the world, it really is a trap. And we have to, as leaders, again, make choices. We have to draw a line. So be aware of the strategy trap. There's lots of really good ones, but let's pick one. The third thing that was near and dear to my heart was this concept around telescoping management. And what this solved for me was what I think is the #1 challenge, particularly for most newer managers. And this is this thing called micromanaging. Everybody talks about it. It's a hard topic. Under the guise of helping people, we tend to get very, very involved in the work lives of the people that we manage. Telescoping is by definition just what it says. It means the ability to telescope in and truly inspect what we expect, which is a big part of the manager's role. But more importantly, that's kind of the easy part, and that tends to be what we all do very well. More importantly, can we telescope back and really unleash these thoroughbreds when it's appropriate to go run wild, in essence, and deliver goals and deliver things that we never imagined? So telescoping was super helpful for me. And then to round it out, and this is where we are today, it's around let's execute. So if we've gone out and gotten the best people with a thoroughbred strategy, we've picked a strategy, we've gotten hopefully good at this telescoping idea, then we really have to go execute. And that's what I want to focus on today, is this fourth component around execution. And for me, it's such a fun topic because over the years and literally decades, there's so much written about this topic. And I think the heart of the question really is, effective leadership, right? I mean, in terms of executing, it's as a leader, how effective are we at getting stuff done, both ourselves individually, but more importantly, the group that we're leading. And what's interesting, if you look at the body of work that's out there, first of all, it's immense. it's immense. I mean, there's so much research that is awesome in this category. There's so many tools to go use about leadership behaviors. What are the characteristics that define incredible leadership? The psychology behind leadership and ultimately fellowship. So this whole category is not void of incredible research and ideas. But for me, again, as an operator, it was kind of daunting. And let me just give you an example. Here's a few of them that may strike a bell with you. This is the DISC score. You're probably familiar with DISC. Many of us have done this. It's a great tool. I think for a lot of organizations has been very helpful. I know it was for me. Another tool, and again, some of these get fairly complex. You can see on this one, we're putting, I think it's 16 different buckets in terms of leadership and behavior, so quite complex. But very helpful. There's the Clifton Strengths that some of you might be familiar with. This is an interesting one. I'm a big fan of the CCL, Center for Creative Leadership. We did a lot of work with them at Assurant, great organization. They tend to focus on these 4 sort of fundamental core leaderships, which again, all these are well worth pursuing and really understanding and working on. But that's their approach. This is a really interesting graphic actually it's really a survey about the top 10 leadership competencies. This is an often debated topic, like what really matters? What are the most important competencies? You can see it's good to see actually that ethics is up there at the top. It's self-organizing, and you can kind of go through the list. There's lots of opinion and thoughts on this. 7 core behaviors. When I look at something like this, I mean, how would you argue with any of those? These are awesome behaviors to have as a leader. But again, as I go through these, and the list kind of goes on and on, not to touch on all of them, but just to really raise this question. I mean, it's a lot of stuff. If we added up all of these, it's literally hundreds of different sort of leadership behaviors and topics that we could go pursue. So what always bugged me as a CEO, which was what really matters out of all these, they all seem important, and I think they all have levels of effectiveness. But what I was really struggling with was there's got to be something that we could simplify and really hone in on what really matters. And probably no surprise, based on the title of this talk today, what I landed on was grit. And I bumped into this about 12-ish years ago. And I think as leaders, we tend to have these inflection points in our work life where we bump into really wise people, this knowledge and experience that I mentioned earlier, that just are game changing for us, that really change this as sort of an inflection point and really change the way that we think about things. And this grit topic really did that for me. It became incredibly impactful for how I thought about running my company, how I thought about building and leading teams, how I thought about my family, quite frankly, and certainly my kids and relationships just in general. So it's a big deal to me. And where I want to start is with what grit isn't, because I want to share with you sort of how I think we can define it, and then we'll get on a little bit of how we can actually get better at grit. But when I've done this talk I've been doing this for years, I tend to get a lot of questions at the end, and I realized it would be better to answer them up front because a lot of the questions at the end were about things that grit really isn't, and I realized I wasn't being clear. So what grit is not is just to keep working harder. And you can see our little guy running through the brick wall there. It's really not about that. It's not about eliminating work-life balance. I was getting this question a lot that, oh, this is a great topic. I kind of buy into it. This just means I work all the time, and doesn't mean that at all. The next thing it means is don't be stubborn. This is not about developing some unique characteristic of stubbornness or foolishness. And again, the brick wall is there for a purpose. This is not about saying I've got a goal and I'm just going to be so gritty that I'll just keep running my head through it. That would both be stubborn and probably an element of foolishness. So that's what grit is not. So what is grit? And here's the definition that I really want to focus on today that, again, has been super helpful and meaningful for me. And the definition is grit is this intersection of passion and perseverance. And again, much like my definition of wisdom, we have to have both knowledge and experience. Same here with grit. Grit has to have both of these characteristics of passion and perseverance. And the second part of this definition is equally as important. This is about long-term meaningful goals. And that's really important because for this to sink in, and if you buy into this concept that I'll share with you today, this is where the impact is. That if we think about what we're trying to do longer term, what really means something to us, again, whether it's professional or personal, and we work on this thing called grit, this passion and perseverance, the likelihood, I will argue, the likelihood of succeeding, whatever that goal is, goes up dramatically. So that's my definition, and the definition that I like most about grit. The other thing I like to point out is that I think measuring across a couple of dimensions is another way to both think about the definition and get some clarity about what it is. And the first dimension is this idea of consistency of interest. So it's not just that we're interested in a topic, again, either professionally or personally, but that we have this consistency of the interest, meaning we're going to keep at that interest for an extended period of time. And again, keep in mind this long-term meaningful goal concept. So consistency of interest is one dimension. The other is perseverance of effort. So it's not just effort, it's not just, and we can all have short-term effort, and I think most people do on a whole host of topics, but the perseverance of the effort starts to go hand in hand with the consistency of the interest. And again, when those two collide, we see a high degree of grit measured across both dimensions, and that's when it gets really exciting. And I'll talk about that later. Some of the results on the high grit individuals and teams are pretty fun to look at. So that's how I define grit, or the definition that I like the best. Next topic is, how do I know that this works? Kind of an interesting topic, and hopefully you found it interesting. Some of you may have studied this in the past, but how do I know that it works? For me, it's quite personal. As I mentioned, when I bumped into this research, it was really before Angela Duckworth wrote the book on grit. And if you haven't read this, I'd really recommend it. It's a great book and a great summary of a lot of the academic work she did to get here, and I'm doing no justice to it today because I'm just doing a quick view of some of her points and then trying to share my practical experience using grit. But I'd really recommend that you go look at this book and dive deep into it. And this is what before she wrote the book, I found her research actually, and she was starting to study this correlation of grit and success. And for me, it was very personal because I was struggling with not just why things were going well, but why was it? And we had some success, as Margaret mentioned when she introduced me at Assurant, and it bothered me as much. I didn't understand why we were doing so well as it did when we were having problems. And so when I started looking into this research, a couple of the examples that were very early on with her that I found really interesting that resonated with me. One was related to West Point, the military academy, and the other one was related to the spelling bee, which most of us have watched the spelling bee on TV. It's really interesting. But if you start with the West Point example, this was really interesting to me because if you're familiar with how the academies work, they really do recruit and are able to historically attract the most, you'd probably say, successful high school students, the ones with the best grades. They have to be very physically fit to even get into West Point. There's a pretty intensive testing and sort of milestones that you have to meet. But what they found was they had a pretty high dropout rate after they did this first summer initiation thing that they do, right? It's basically to really test the mettle of the cadets in the first summer, but they had a pretty high dropout rate. So some of her original work was around this topic, like, why is this happening? These are the best students, they have the best scores, they're physically fit, they can do lots of pull-ups. Why the high dropout rate? And so what you can see, and I won't go through each of these points, but it's pretty astounding that the correlation she started to find as she tested people's grit, and you guys have all taken the grit test now, so we'll look at your scores later, but she found a very high correlation, as you can see here, to their grit score and their ability to complete this very, very hard summer program. I just found that really interesting because some of these things are very counterintuitive. And again, in my search for this correlation of success, this really got my attention. The second one did as well, which was the idea that the spelling bee, if you've watched this, it's really fascinating watching these young folks compete in this. And and same correlation, she studied like, why is it that people do better than others, and these kids that did better, and again, a very strong correlation between grit score. And you can see on the second bullet point here that the finalists with grit score is just a standard deviation above the mean, 41% more likely to advance. I mean, if you think about that for a second, and if you just use this as just one simple proxy sort of success and promotion and moving forward, or sports or anything. I mean, if somebody was to tell you, I've got a way for you to have a 41% higher chance of moving forward or getting to your goal, I think we would all sort of jump on that. And it's pretty interesting. And part of this thing that she's written about that I also found interesting, and some of this is just super practical, which was, well, you have to, if you have a pretty high grit score, it kind of makes sense, because they also found that the kids that do the best in these spelling bee competitions are the ones that memorize the most spelling words. And when I step back and think about that, it's like, wow, that takes a lot of grit. You talk about passion and perseverance towards a long-term goal. To sit and memorize spelling words is pretty rough for me, or it would be. But again, the correlation and the statistical data that she started to accumulate was really compelling for me. So that was part of my journey on grit. Was again this research I bumped into, and then I started really thinking about my team and some of the stuff that we were challenged with. And again, Margaret mentioned a couple of parts of my corporate work life that were really meaningful. One was our global expansion, which required a lot of grit. And the other one was this digital journey. And I use this as an example because so many of our clients and companies are going through this now. I know everyone listening in today is involved at some level in some type of digital journey. And again, I go back to my statement sort of about these jobs in general. This is pretty hard stuff. And when I was looking at this at Assurant, we were a legacy insurance company, and we did a lot of warranty work and service contract stuff, but they were core insurance companies. And I think it'd be safe to say not the most digitally savvy organizations. Not to mention we were the product of 20 or 30 acquisitions and putting systems together, and you guys get all that story. But safe to say, not a digitally savvy company. And I woke up one day, this is about 6 years ago, and said, to get to my point B, to my next destination, we are going to have to be incredibly digital savvy. And that was a hard thing for us. And one, we didn't have the internal knowledge and experience or wisdom to do it. But I knew we could get there because our team had really conquered a lot of other things that were really hard. But this was around the time that I bumped into Angela Duckworth's work. And long story short, ended up testing my team and started working on this topic. And the reason this is very personal for me is that we did pretty well in digital. And it was only two reasons when I sort of debriefed several years later why we were able to build a digital company really and change the way people thought about us. It was only two things. One was we were able to go find some really, really wise people that were willing to help us. Again, these people with knowledge and experience on things we didn't. So there was an element of humility around that. And that became really, really important to the organization. But the second thing was a relatively high grit score. And that's what really got my attention when I started trying to figure out what was different with my team. And we did some of the same testing that you guys just did. It takes a few minutes. And we started looking at it, I realized even though we had a very diverse team, we had a commonality around this interesting thing called grit. And that's ultimately what I believe sort of helped us punched through and became really good at this stuff. So that's really kind of all I needed to get really interested in the topic and seeing it work in all of this research and case studies, but more importantly, seeing it work for my own organization and seeing the confidence that it started to build with my team, knowing that as long as we kept working on this thing called grit, and as long as we kept getting better at it, we would be able to pick one of these strategies that I talked about earlier, get out of the strategy trap, pick one, and we had a pretty high likelihood of succeeding. Which leads me really to, I think, one of the most exciting parts of this whole topic is grit can grow. And this is a little different than a lot of the leadership behaviors that we talk about. And if you go back to a few minutes ago when I was scrolling through all of the testing that we can do and all the different behaviors we can focus on, and again, not suggesting that any of those aren't worthwhile to pursue. But one of the challenge with them in a lot of the testing is it is who we are. It is back to instinctual personality stuff. Some we can modify a little bit and some we can't, and we just work around. And again, that's all super helpful. What I love about grit, though, is if you buy into this concept and you buy into the fact that this long-term focus on measurable goals through passion and perseverance is a game changer like I did, this is the best news of all, is that we can improve it. So no matter what your score was when you took the little test a few minutes ago, it can go up. And I've seen this now in my own organization going back almost 12 years now. And the fun part being out for the last 3 years and sharing this with many organizations and clients around the world, I've seen it across most industries and organizations and parts of organization that have sort of taken this seriously. But I find this super encouraging that if you buy in, it can grow. And just a couple ideas on how do we grow our grit. This is not an exhaustive list, but a couple 5 or 6 things that really are meaningful to me that have worked for me and my groups that I've worked with. Number one is self-awareness, and you've actually just started to do that, which is let's just see where we are on the grit scale. Again, if you buy into the concept, you got to start there. Let's have some humility and just see where we are. So we have to have some self-awareness of our starting point. Strong habits are essential to this. If we rely on motivation, really for anything in life from that standpoint, it's super short term. If we buy into this and we believe in this longer term measurable goal that we're willing to pursue with this passion and perseverance, we've got to build habits around that and not just rely on short-term motivation. And this goes hand in hand. I'm a big fan of small wins. One of the biggest challenges I saw in my own organization and then in the many, many companies we help now is we have a tendency to boil the ocean on stuff. I did it. I was a big offender at that. I see lots of people doing it today. And it's very destructive in our journey to get better at grit because it's hard. And by definition, boiling the ocean doesn't happen very much. Almost never. So I'm a big fan of go find some small wins. If you believe in that longer term goal or vision or strategy, start picking off the milestones and go get some small wins. It's the best way you can learn to be grittier. Frame failure is an opportunity. You guys hear that a lot, I'm sure. This is not a new concept. What I would tell you here is it is essential when we're talking about passion and perseverance and getting better at grip. If we don't have a culture where we immediately take failure, have a conversation about it, and frame that as an opportunity to learn and grow, we just won't get there on the grit quotient. Remain in pursuit of goals. Don't stop. Wow, you're probably thinking that's just not a super thoughtful comment. It's pretty obvious. Well, it is obvious. But again, what I saw in my own organization and now I've seen across so many companies is the biggest challenge is people just stop. We lose that initial inertia, the initial motivation, the initial excitement. It's kind of like a relationship, quite candidly. And then we have a tendency to stop because it gets a little bit harder. And anything on this list, if I could recommend, if you build a culture where we're not going to stop, again, it's not being hard-headed. We're not going to go foolishly run through a wall, but we might stop at that wall and then go to the next wall and conquer that. And if we do that over time, we will get there, but we cannot stop. And then finally, develop a growth mindset. It's incredibly important on this grit journey that this really is about growing. There is no other topic that this applies to. The examples I use, people are going to the military academy to grow personally. The spelling bee, there's lots of examples on grit research around sports, and the correlation of people's success in sports correlate much higher to grit than any other metric that's out there. But it's all about growth. Am I wanting to grow personally, and do I want my organization to grow? And if that's the mindset and the culture, this actually starts to go hand in hand very naturally. So the journey to 4.0 and beyond, as I call it, this is a scale from 1 to 5. And so very quickly, just get your score out and let's take a look at where you are. This is kind of fun to do when I'm in a group setting because we have everybody score it in the room. And if it's a single company, then we score it as a group and see where you are. And you can sort of see the scale here, again, from 1 to 5. And this is how I think about it. This is just my body of work on what I've seen in my own organization and in other organizations and where these scores fit and just sort of how I see their success. It's not 100% scientific, so don't get too caught up in this. But I look at the 1.0. If we're at a 1.0, that's a little bit of a rut row. That's a scientific term, which is we got a lot of work to do. I've never seen that. To a 2.0, if that's your score area, it's a lot of room for improvement. And again, the cool thing is that we can improve on grit, so it's not a foregone conclusion that you'll always be there. Duckworth's original study saw an average, if we take individuals and organizations, an average of about a 3.65. So now we're getting a pretty high grit score category. And then above 4.0, I call that, this was my own organization and then other companies that we've worked with, this is where it starts to get really exciting, that above a 4.0, you're really doing significantly above average, and we're starting to see very different results. 4.2 is even better. It's kind of where my organization started landing above that. And what I found there, that was an inflection point, that 4 to 4.2, where we were starting to accomplish things that earlier we really didn't believe could happen. And that's when I got excited about working hard to get to the 4.2. And I call 4.5 and above, and it's very achievable if you work on this stuff, kind of unstoppable. And if I was to pause and reflect on where we are today, and really uncharted waters, I think we would all agree with that we're in incredibly uncertain and uncharted waters. What better time potentially to work on this? I mean, coming out, and we will come out of this on the other side, but coming out of this, wouldn't it be cool if we were approaching that unstoppable category? Because we're going to have a lot of hard stuff to go do, I think. I think we would all agree with that. And so I would say there's no better time than to hopefully take this seriously, spend a little bit of time on it, absorb it, and if you buy into it, I think you get above 4.0 individually, and particularly as a leader with your team, you'll start to see results that I think might really surprise you. So to wrap up, again, the 3 things I really were meaningful to me around the thoroughbreds, and that's just my people strategy. I encourage you to do that. Pick a strategy, learn how to telescope, and really this idea of inspect what you expect, but then be able to telescope back and unleash these thoroughbreds. And on execution, once you pick the strategy, just get the grit score up, and I promise you that it will be a lot of fun. You'll see results that you probably haven't before. And with that, I thank you for your time. And Margaret, I'll turn it back over to you to see if we have any questions.
Craig, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate you sharing today. We are going to open it up for just a minute if there's any questions that come through in our box here for the audience. Feel free to send those through to us. While we're giving the audience a moment to do that, I'm just going to summarize a couple of things that really stood out to me personally as you were talking. And one that I think it really stood out is around habits. And I think as we're all adjusting to some of us working in different environments, be that home or different spaces in our home, and adjusting to that. I think habits are so important, and sticking with, they help you through times that are uncertain. And I keep telling my team as well to, we know we're doing the right things. Let's just stay focused on doing the right things. So keeping those good habits. I really liked what you said around learning on the successes and the failures. I think we're all learning a lot right now, and there are going to be some failures in that as we're doing new things and trying new things, and those are just learning opportunities. And then the small wins, I think that's also really important right now. We may be in a period of time where we're not having a lot of big wins. And so really being sure that we are celebrating those small wins along the way. And then the growth mindset is kind of the last thing that I really made a strong note of to myself as you were talking was, remembering that we're always need to just stay in a growth mindset and keep that culture and keep that. So thank you again for your sharing today. We've got just a couple of questions that have come through. One here for you is, if everyone is a thoroughbred, how does collaboration across the organization work?
No, it's a great question, and what I found is that it a little bit breeds on itself on the success of these folks. They are harder. It tends to be harder to manage when you hire the best people. I mean, I call them go-go people. They want to go and get stuff done. Again, that racehorse visual is extremely important. But I also find that part of that competitive spirit tends to be to help each other. And again, everybody has to decide what culture they want in their organization. For us, that was topic number one. We were going to build an organization where we helped each other. We tended to have goals, mutual goals, particularly at the leadership level, where we all benefited from the group's success. The other question I get around the thoroughbreds is really linked to grit. And what's surprising is the higher the grit score, which tends to be thoroughbreds tend to embrace this and really do it, then what I've seen over the years is the higher the collaboration. And that's a little counterintuitive because, again, you think of people running through walls, but what we've seen is the higher the grit score, particularly with thoroughbreds, the higher the collaboration, and they tend to feed off each other and really support each other. So it does work. It's a great question, though.
Yeah, that's great. Got one last question for
Yep.
you, and I've also brought up your contact information for everyone to grab here. And the last question I have for you is, how do you use this as part of your interviewing strategy?
Yeah, and there again, this is something I wouldn't recommend making it an exact data point. I mean, we actually have people that have done that, much like they did with the military academy. But I always used it as part of my conversations. And again, you get very familiar with those 10 questions. It's super easy if just in a conversation after you've done this a while to really get a sense of people's grit score. I don't know why I make everything a game, I guess, but I've kind of gamified it in my own mind to try to guess people's grit score after I've met them. And again, after 10 years of doing this, I've gotten pretty good at guessing grit scores because again, the questions are pretty straightforward. So I'd really recommend that you do that and start weaving them into your conversations as you talk to talent and start and use it in your hiring process.
Well, great. Okay, so after this, I'm going to come back to you and ask you what you think my grit score is.
Oh,
Don't
I
say
can't wait.
that.
I can't wait. I love that.
Well, well, Greg, thank you so much. Again, we appreciate
My
it.
pleasure.
I know, say behalf on all of our audience, thanks for sharing today, and I'm sure that you'll be having lots of people reach out and stay connected with you.
Happy to, and happy to just chat with anybody if you want to follow up on the topic. I love talking about it, obviously, so I'm happy to help any way we can. But thanks again, Margaret, for having me.
Thank you.